Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, flower pot men, flower pot men, flower pot men, Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, flower pot men.
Once upon a time, there was a little house. And all round the house was a beautiful garden. And down at the bottom of the garden was a place where the man who worked in the garden left his things while he went into the house to have his dinner. One day, when he'd gone into the house to have his dinner, he left behind an old glue pot, some seed boxes, and some packets of seeds. There were other things lying about, some flower pots, 2 little ones, 2 middle-sized ones, and 2 great big ones. And just behind the big flower pots was a little weed. And there they all were, lying quietly in the sunshine. The little weed looked all about her, and when she saw that everything was quiet, she knocked gently on the 2 big flower pots and said, and slowly, out of the flower pots, came the flower pot men. First, out came their little faces, smiling all over. Then their little hands with big garden gloves on. They both turned round and saw each other. Then they said hello to the little weed in their flower pot way of talking. And the little weed laughed and said, "Weed, weed." And the flower pot men thought she meant that someone was coming. So they popped down into their flower pots again. And all was quiet and drowsy in the sunshine, and the little weed stayed in between the flower pots and said nothing. After a time, one of the flower pot men thought, surely there's nobody about. And he popped his head up for a minute to have a look round. Then the other flower pot man thought, surely there's no one about. And he popped his head up to have a look round. And they went on like this for quite a long time. Then both together. Do you know what all that meant? There's nobody about, so let's get out and play. Now, the man who works in the garden had been putting seeds in little seed boxes. And the 2 flower pot men went over to have a look. So they leaned over to see if the seeds were coming up. They weren't. They were all fast asleep in their little seed beds. One of the flower pot men said, Are they coming up your end?
No.
So the other flower pot man said, how can we make the seeds come up? Then they thought of all sorts of things they could do to make the seeds come up. And some of them were rather silly. And look, those funny little flower pot men began running all round the seed boxes to see if that would make the seeds come up. But the seeds didn't come up. So they sat down and did some more thinking. Then one of them had a good idea. He said, let's try hopping round on one leg. But still the seeds didn't come up. So the flower pot men leaned on the edge of the seed box and wondered what they could do next. Now, the little weed in between the two big flower pots had been watching what the flower pot men were doing, and she thought of something to help them. She flapped her leaves and called out, "Weed! Weed!" So the two flower pot men hurried over to see what she wanted.
What?
Then she leaned over and whispered something. And what she said was, water. The seeds won't come up without water. So they looked everywhere for some water. Suddenly, they saw the old glue pot. They looked inside, and what do you think? At the bottom of the glue pot was some rainwater. So they picked up the glue pot very carefully and carried it over to the seed boxes and poured some water on the seeds. waited, quiet as two little mice. At first they heard nothing at all. Then they heard a tiny little noise, as though the seeds were saying, "Shall we come up, or shan't we?" Then they heard a tiny rustling and bustling, and then up popped the flowers all together. And the flower pot men started dancing and singing.
Oh, lubba, lubba, flower. Lubba, flower. Whoa.
The flowers have come. Isn't it fun? Look what the beautiful seeds have done.
A flower have come. On the pond.
The flower pot men stopped for a minute to get their breath. But the flowers went on dancing. And do you know what they were saying?
No man who digs a garden thinks we're flowers seeds, but we are puppies up and down because we're only weeds, because we're only weeds.
Oh, well, because we're only weeds.
Oh, we are lovers, because we're only weeds, because we're only weeds.
And the little flowers were laughing so much that they were quite tired. So they sank back into their little beds to have a rest. But while one flower pot man sat there laughing, the other one crept away because he had thought of something rather naughty. And all this while the little weed was watching. She had seen which one of the flower pot men had tipped the water over the other. Now, you listen, because she's going to ask a question.
Was it Bill or was it Ben? Tipped the water out just then. Which of those two flower pot men? Was it Bill or was it Ben?
Did you hear what the little weed said? Do you know who it was? Listen again.
Was it Bill or was it Ben? Tipped the water out just then. Which of those two flower pot men? Was it Bill or was it Ben?
Was it Ben? Or was it Bill? It was Bill. It was Bill. Bad little Bill.
Bad little bull. Oh, let's go and talk to the weed.
Then the two flower pot men went over to speak to the flowers again and see how they were getting on.
Hello, little weed. Hello, buddy mom. Oh.
And they would have come right up, but the little weed thought she heard someone coming, so she called out to let them know that the man who worked in the garden had finished his dinner and was coming out again.
Hello.
So the two flower pot men jumped into their flower pots and said goodbye to each other.
Hello.
Then they said goodbye to the little weed.
Wobble, little weed. Wobble, wobble, wobble.
Wop, little weed. Wop, 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 wop.
The little weed stayed behind the flower pots and went fast asleep. And there they all were in the warm sunshine. But the man who worked in the garden didn't know that anything had happened at all. Nobody knew about the flower pot men. Only you saw them playing. And the little weed. And I think the little house knew something about it. Don't you?
Goodbye, Bill, goodbye, Ben. Bill and Ben, flower pot men. Goodbye, Bill, goodbye, Ben. Bill and Ben.